A strange sound, then a wave of sweetness in Death, Boston. January 15, 1919. It was just after noon on a chilly winter's day in the city's north end. A neighborhood alive with Italian immigrants, dock workers, and children playing in the streets. The day felt ordinary. Horses pulling carts, mothers hanging laundry, men working near the harbor. Then came a groan. Witnesses later described it as a sound like machine gun fire, or rivets snapping in succession. Others swore it was more like a thunderclap. What followed was something out of a surreal nightmare. A massive storage tank, holding more than 2 million gallons of thick brown molasses, ruptured with explosive force. Within seconds, a wall of hot, sticky liquid, towering nearly 25 feet high in places, rushed out at 35 miles per hour. Buildings were flattened, horses drowned, streets were ripped apart, and dozens of people were swept to their deaths in what would forever be remembered as the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. It sounds absurd at first. Molasses, the slow, syrupy sweetener, usually dribbled over pancakes or stirred into recipes moving fast enough to kill. Yet for Boston, this was no laughing matter. The flood left destruction that rivaled natural disasters and raised serious questions about corporate negligence, safety standards, and the responsibility industries have to the communities around them. This is the story of how one of America's strangest disasters unfolded, how it reshaped Boston's North End, and why it still matters more than a century later. The molasses tank. A giant in the North End. To understand the disaster, we need to picture the tank itself. Standing 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, the steel tank dominated Commercial Street in Boston's busy waterfront district. Built in 1915, it was owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA. At the time, molasses wasn't just a sweetener, it was a critical ingredient for making industrial alcohol, which was then used in ammunition and, increasingly, rum and other spirits. World War I had created huge demand for such products, and USIA rushed to build the tank to take advantage of the boom. But here's the problem. The tank was poorly constructed. The steel plates were too thin for the pressure they needed to withstand. Rivets holding the plates together often popped out under stress. The tank leaked from the very beginning, so much that neighborhood kids collected molasses in cups from the dripping seams. Rather than fix the problem, the company painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. Inside, pressure built as molasses, some recently shipped in and still warm, was poured into the already full tank. Warm molasses mixing with colder, older molasses likely caused fermentation, releasing gases and creating even more internal pressure. The tank, in short, was a ticking time bomb. The explosion, January 15, 1919 at 12:40 p.m. The neighborhood shook. People heard the roar first, metal tearing, rivets firing like bullets. Then the tank gave way, releasing 2.3 million gallons of molasses in an instant. The wave that burst forth was unlike anything witnesses had ever seen. Moving at the speed of a horse-drawn carriage, the thick brown surge tore through Commercial Street with unimaginable force. Buildings were crushed, wooden houses splintered, the Boston Elevated Railway's tracks were twisted, and an entire firehouse was ripped from its foundation. People were swept away. Pedestrians, workers, and children playing in the streets were engulfed. Some suffocated in the sticky liquid, others were battered against debris. Horses were doomed. Many delivery horses drowned, their strength useless against the sucking pull of molasses. One man compared it to being hit by a tidal wave. Another said it was like being swallowed by quicksand, only thicker and hotter. The chaos was immediate and horrifying. Cries for help echoed as survivors struggled to pull themselves free. Rescuers had to wade into waist-deep syrup to search for trapped victims. The human cost: the flood claimed 21 lives and injured around 150 people. The dead ranged in age from children to adults, including workers, housewives, and firefighters. A 10-year-old boy named Pasquale Iantosca was among those killed while playing nearby. Workers at the firehouse of Engine 31 were crushed or drowned when the wave demolished their building. Many victims died slowly, suffocating as molasses filled their mouths and lungs. The injured suffered gruesome wounds, broken bones, deep cuts from debris, and infections from the sticky filth that clung to open wounds. For weeks afterward, the neighborhood reeked of molasses. Rescue workers reported that removing bodies was a dreadful task, as the syrup clung so tightly it had to be cut away from flesh and clothing. Even the cleanup crews, sailors, police, and Red Cross workers, found themselves stuck in molasses as they tried to shovel it away. Cleaning up the mess, imagine trying to clean an entire city block drowned in sticky syrup. It wasn't just the streets that were coated. Molasses seeped into cellars, homes, and businesses. Every step taken in the North End was followed by the sound of boots peeling away from the goo. The cleanup took weeks, with firemen spraying seawater from Boston Harbor onto the streets and workers scraping hardened molasses off surfaces. Yet even months later, molasses clung to places no one expected, under manhole covers, in basements, on the beams of the elevated railway. Bostonians joked that every time it rained, the streets of the North End smelled sweet for years afterward. Even in the summer heat, the faint smell of molasses lingered. The investigation. Who was to blame? The Great Molasses Flood wasn't just a bizarre accident. It became one of the first major corporate accountability cases in U.S. history. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company quickly tried to shift blame. Their defense was that anarchists had planted a bomb at the tank, citing the wave of anarchist bombings sweeping the country at the time. But investigators found no evidence of sabotage. Instead, it became clear that the company had been grossly negligent. The tank was rushed into use before engineers properly tested it. It leaked constantly, a sign of weakness ignored by management. Experts later confirmed the steel used was brittle and too thin for safety. The lawsuits dragged on for 6 years. Ultimately, USIA was found liable. The company paid out $628,000 in damages, equivalent to more than $10 million today. Families of victims received compensation, though no amount of money could undo the suffering. This case set a precedent for holding corporations responsible for public safety. It also led to stricter regulations in engineering, construction, and municipal oversight, helping prevent similar disasters in the future. Why was molasses so important? To modern readers, it might seem odd that a company would store millions of gallons of molasses in the middle of a city. But in the early 20th century, molasses was big business. It was a key ingredient in producing ethanol, used for making munitions during World War I. It was also essential for distilling rum, a major industry at the time. For working-class families, molasses was a cheap sweetener, more common than refined sugar. Boston, as a port city, was a hub for molasses imports, mostly from the Caribbean. The North End, already crowded with immigrant families, was chosen as the storage site because it was close to the docks and rail lines. Unfortunately, this meant that when disaster struck, it devastated one of the city's most vulnerable communities. Survivors' stories. One of the most striking parts of the molasses flood is the testimony of those who lived through it. Anthony DeStasio, a young boy, recalled being picked up by the wave and carried like a toy. He remembered floating in the syrup, unable to breathe until he lost consciousness. Miraculously, he survived. Rescuers spoke of wading into the flood, describing the sensation of being trapped. Every movement slowed to a crawl as the sticky liquid resisted. Horses, once the backbone of city transport, screamed as they drowned, a sound witnesses never forgot. For survivors, the flood wasn't just about physical scars. It was a traumatic event that haunted them for life, an ever-present reminder that even something as simple as molasses could become a killer. Legacy of the disaster today. The Great Molasses Flood lives on as one of history's strangest catastrophes, often retold with a hint of dark humor. But its legacy is more than quirky trivia. It highlighted the dangers of corporate shortcuts and lack of safety oversight. It pushed Boston, and eventually the nation, toward stronger building regulations. It became a rallying point for immigrant communities demanding justice against powerful corporations. In Boston's North End today, a small plaque marks the site of the disaster. Locals still share the tale, half in disbelief, half in solemn memory of those who died. The flood teaches us that history's oddest events often carry the most serious lessons. Sometimes danger doesn't roar like a hurricane or blaze like a fire. Sometimes it comes slowly until it doesn't.